So guys, now I'm just gonna be doing like a European war. So last video was basically a US kind of war thing. And so this time a European one. So there's gonna be two sides, or maybe even three. So the first one is the blue side, which is the attacker. I meant the defender, and then the red side being the attacker, and the yellow side being an unknown. So, first, Norway is basically just making their own empire. This is completely fictional, so this has nothing to do with political stuff. So yeah, Ukraine has its own empire now, which is blue, and Norway is trying to invade it, since they made their own empire recently. Eventually, both sides try to convince Poland, but they just stay as an unknown, because they really don't know what to decide. They're closer to Ukraine, though, so they might change their mind. And Norway eventually takes out Denmark as well as Copenhagen. And then, eventually, they make a push in Germany, taking out Berlin, even taking a bit of Poland. However, Poland fights back as they are a neutral state, and this causes a war. So, now each side is defended, and eventually Poland convinces Russia to join them. So, that happens. And since Russia is the biggest country in Europe and Asia and in the world, really, this happens. Finland, eventually France makes their own team. With that, Andorra, Spain, and Portugal join them, because they really don't know which side to join, and plus the French side is closest to them. Eventually Italy joins in, and so does Malta. The UK kind of stays neutral for a bit, and the UK and Ireland kind of stay neutral for a bit. And they're surrounded by two sides. The French side and the Norwegian side. Eventually, they want to join this side, so England joins the purple side. And eventually with that, Wales does too. And Scotland wants to also, but before they can actually sign an agreement to do that, Norway takes it over. Ireland just was also invaded. And so, eventually Sweden was invaded, so was Finland. And Ukraine was having trouble getting people on their team. So yeah, eventually they made a proposal to the Balkans, causing the Ukrainian side to be bigger, as well as mainland Germany. And eventually, because it's aid of Ukraine for some reason, they managed to take back with the Germans on the side of Ukraine. Ukraine and Germany managed to gain back Berlin. And then this happens. Turkey, since they don't really like Greece, and plus they're kind of surrounded by both of them, they decide to join the Polish side. And then this happens. Eventually the Norwegians managed to capture all of mainland Russia, and eventually capturing Moscow, as well as St. Petersburg, which is pretty populous. And then eventually Ukraine hates Russia, so they're just gonna take all this land. And then the fronts of Ukraine and Norway meet, and they really don't do anything, but eventually this front by Poland is captured, and eventually Norway takes Warsaw. And then this happens. Surprisingly, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Scotland had officially escaped the terrors of Scotland, Norwegian Northern Ireland, and Norwegian Ireland. So, yes, this is the current map right now. And eventually, a purple landing makes it in the Norwegian front and starts pushing in, eventually capturing Oslo. Then eventually they get to Stockholm. And keep in mind, this is all Scandinavia, so yeah. And then they manage to get Helsinki. And then pretty much it's just cut off. And then this is what it looks like. So yes. And eventually the Norwegian front surrenders, but there was an agreement to let both the French front and the Ukrainian front get that way. Eventually, since Warsaw was captured at this point, the Polish front has officially surrendered. And then that makes only two fronts remaining. The Ukrainian front and the French front. Eventually, many naval landings had been made. And then eventually all the fronts connect to that our mainland, and basically just make an entire front even bigger. And eventually one front is cut off, surrenders. Another front cut off, surrendered. More fronts cut off and surrendered. And then eventually they capture Paris, London, Rome, Andorra, Madrid, and all of this. And so the Ukrainians may have won. Surprisingly, they started making a ton of outposts and just making this, and then eventually making newer Spain. And newer practically the empire. And then they capture Kyiv, but since they're low on resources, because all their resources are now in possession of Ukraine, the French front officially surrenders. So yeah, that was a pretty cool video. So yeah.